You know, quarantine may have been some absolute garbage, but one thing I can credit it for is finally getting me to play some different games. One of those games was Dark Souls 3, my first ever Souls game. Kinda. You see, I've always flirted around a bit with the Souls series. It grabbed my attention years ago, back when I was an ignorant middle school child who had absolutely no idea how badly these games would bend me over, so I bought a package deal containing Dark Souls 1 and 3. It went about how you'd expect, me putting a couple hours into both games, getting my ass rammed with the power of Smo's hammer. See, the joke here has two meanings, since I never actually got that far in the first game. So yeah, I quit the games thinking that they were impossible, and went back to doing Jumpy Cube Extreme Demons, since those were somehow easier. Time skipped to a few weeks back, and my girlfriend got Dark Souls 3 gifted to her, which reminded me of how the very same game had been sitting dormant in my Steam library for years. I decided to give it another shot, and ended up loving it. Before I begin, let me clarify three things. Number one, these are my opinions. I know this is a blatantly obvious statement, but a lot of people need to be reminded nonetheless. Number two, I currently only have one full playthrough of Dark Souls 3 under my belt, plus some experimenting around with the boss rush mod. I know some people in the Souls community feel like you're not allowed to have an opinion on a boss unless you've beat it on a Soul Level 1 speedrun with one hand tied behind your back while getting pegged by GUNDYR. So if that's you, then click off this video at once. Lastly, the footage for these bosses was taken using the boss rush mod. Don't get me wrong, I adored Dark Souls 3, but I'm not the kind of person who can instantly sink another 20 hours into a second playthrough immediately after beating a game. Besides, the bosses are the main highlight, as I'm sure you all know, so without wasting any more time, let's get into the rankings. I'm sure most of you are expecting this, but I was actually debating placing it higher on the list. See, I'm a bit confused as to whether I should count the one button click required to kill this spiky bastard as the whole boss experience, or if I should include the bullshit run up to that one click featuring this spawn of Satan as well. Since the annoying dragon mobs don't attack you as you're attacking the boss, I decided to separate them out and just included dealing with the wyvern. And yeah, if you somehow haven't seen this fight before, all you have to do is a single plunge attack and this wyvern will be doing the worm in no time. You can miss the attack and fall to your death, but in order to do so you'd have to have both the eyesight and timing of an anemic bat. You can also fight this beast on the ground, but I'm not going for bragging points, just beating the damn game gives me enough of those already. I don't have anything else to say except don't mess up the single tap required to make this wyvern join as LOTHRIC kin. The Deacons are here instead of last place because they don't die when you sneeze in their general direction, and that's really about it. A few sword swings will do them in just fine though. At first you might panic because there are enough deacons to molest an entire church choir, but then you realize they're just frail old men, like in the real world. Unlike the real world, they can summon some freaky magic that's about as effective as a stray stream of piss. It's more insulting than actually threatening. From there it's about finding whichever deacon is glowing with the power of Satan and promptly exercising his ass to Cloud 9. Halfway through the fight, the head deacon himself comes in to say hello, only to find his congregation of Walmart whales getting penetrated by your sword. Being the head creep, he's more than willing to participate, and while with his age clearly comes experience since he's able to last quite a bit longer, he goes down just the same, just not onto a child for once. The only way you die here is if you stand in place and do nothing. Plow through some fatties and enjoy your free souls. I mentioned being an ignorant middle schooler not knowing the ass beating I was getting myself into the first time I played this game, but even prepubescent me was able to take out the IUDEX with little trouble. This makes sense as he's the tutorial boss, and after doing a little research it seems most people find him to be the hardest tutorial boss in the series, not counting whatever the fuck Demon Souls was doing. At the time of making the video, the only others I've taken on are the Asylum Demon and Cleric Beast, but I found both of those to be significantly harder. Not sure why, but at least this is a good way to slowly ease you into my controversial opinions, which only get worse as the video continues, trust me. The first half of IUDEX is very straightforward. Dodge the extremely telegraphed attacks by rolling in either direction. He's intimidating for sure, but once you finish shitting yourself the first time you see him, you'll realize he's almost as slow as you are. The second phase is much more erratic, but by using the power of the boss rush mod and fighting IUDEX over leveled, you barely even get to see the transformation, so I'll be stealing someone else's footage to demonstrate for a second. The first time I had no idea what to do in this phase, so my strategy pretty much came down to spam roll in circles around him, go in for a swipe or two, back off, and repeat. This actually worked wonders, and I downed this badass without much trouble. A great introduction fight, but not a hard one unless you don't pay attention. I'll leave my thoughts on YHORM being a puzzle or gimmick boss out until the quality ranking, but I will say it was stressful as shit trying to equip the Stormruler in the middle of a fight. Considering it was my first playthrough, I wasn't frequently switching weapons and completely choked while grabbing and equipping it, twice, because my small brain didn't think to, equip it between the fight. The third try I went at him with my own sword, which really didn't add much difficulty considering you could take a shit and fire up a bidet right in front of him in the time it takes this man to raise his house-sized sword, but it was extremely tedious and I got bored after chunking him down to a third of his health and successfully switched over to the Stormruler. Only took you 3 tries, dumbass. Sheesh. As long as you're patient with when you charge the Stormruler, there's very little difficulty here. He does hit hard if you let him, but in that case simply tell him not to by tapping the dodge button at almost any time. I had an interesting time with the boss act tree. Back when I first played Dark Souls 3, this was the boss that caused me to quit the game. I didn't know he was optional at the time, but to be honest, there wasn't a point in progressing past it if I couldn't beat it anyways. To give 13-year-old me a little slack, this tree has really weird movements, especially with its hand that exists where its cock should be in the second phase. It's also quite difficult to keep the camera on him at all times, which is not helped when one of the very friendly locals comes up and taps you on the shoulder to ask you for some directions, causing you to deal with that right as he decides to give birth all over you. I mean, at least it kills the basic bitch mobs. I could make this boss weirdly sexual, but taking one look at the thing makes me not want to in the slightest, except for the cock hand. That's pretty funny. If you take the scrotum sapling slowly and save most of your Estus for the second phase, then the difficulty here shifts more towards blatant annoyance. Ah yes, the community-proclaimed vape god. Not exactly sure what lungs he's using to consume all this black tar abyss smoke, but I'll take your word for it. Now that I think about it, maybe it's the shitty air that's making this dude so pissed off in the first place. When it comes to difficulty, WOLNIR edges out the previous bosses by making me nervous. He never actually killed me, but both times I fought him, he took my health down to uncomfortably low levels, which smoking also does, so be careful kids. Part of this was due to all the annoying skellies that wouldn't stop spawning. They're similar to the villagers around the nutsack noodle in the sense that the boss eventually kills them off, but they're much more threatening while they're around here. WOLNIR himself also packs a much heavier punch, just like he's punching them packs. Also, like Curse Rotted, you have to go after highlighted points on the boss, this time quite literally since you're trying to put a hole in his neon glow bracelets. They're surprisingly durable, at least with my weapon of choice. I guess what I'm trying to say is that this dude is literally a harder, albeit slightly less disgusting ballsack tree. I'd love to see some R34 art of these two. Good old Curse Rotted could specifically tend to those with the vomit fetish. I eagerly walked up to this boss with cash in hand, ready to embrace what I had been craving, but apparently there was a bit of mishap as to what kind of crystal this sage was selling, and he was not happy that I stepped up on his turf. This fight feels very weirdly paced to me. The first phase is a complete joke, just dodge his very first attack and then wail on him a few times. He might teleport away, but that's a-okay since when he responds you only have to avoid 1 or 2 more very easy to avoid spells. Then you get in the second phase, which convinces me he might have a bit of crystal on him after all, since I'm now seeing like 6 of these fuckers. This portion is much harder. If you get lucky and the real boss spawn near you, then you just do the same thing as earlier. Most of the time, he's actually on the other side of the arena, and getting over to him is an absolute bitch. I'm sure you could carefully assess your surroundings and pick off each clone one at a time, but I don't have that kind of patience and took the YOLO run straight towards him every single time. This got me killed twice, but picking off the clones probably would take the same amount of time. Either way, this sage's low health pool doesn't make for a horrendous fight, which makes me glad he didn't have what I was looking for. Fighting a methed out version of this dude is the last thing I would want to do. VORDT can be seen as the boss that tests your ability to dodge large swipes and charges from beast-like enemies 3 times your size, or as the golden ass-whacking simulator. It's a cool fight, but fairly exploitable if you know what to do. The first phase seems intimidating, but then you realize you can just roll under him and he won't even notice, continuing to swipe at the spot you were 5 seconds earlier. From there you can hack away at his stubby little legs or move around to his back end to give him his annual prostate exam. The choice is yours. You'll have plenty of time to get a few hits in as he takes his rage out on the invisible man in front of him, and when he turns around again, just roll back under him and repeat. What puts this fight above the rest so far for me is his second phase, specifically the charge attack. I found the roll timing for it to be pretty difficult when compared to anything else I'd faced at this point, and while I dealt with it much better in this footage, it knocked me flat on my ass a few times the first go around. At least when you survive that, he winds up the slowest frost breath attack of all time. Even underleveled, you should be able to carve out a good portion of his health while he's charging it. In conclusion, avoid facing VORDT head on and stick to that chubby ass and underbelly. A lot of people find the champ to be a fairly difficult fight, but I'd put him in the mildly challenging category considering I beat him on my third go. He's a step up over IUDEX, no doubt. Dodging his backwards kick was probably the hardest attack for me to get the hang of. It's so fast and comes out of nowhere. In fact, anytime the champ decides to use something that's not his main weapon, he becomes really fast and scary, so it's best to just focus on getting out of the way. That being said, his halberd attacks are surprisingly the least threatening thing about him. From what I can tell, they're just as telegraphed and easy to avoid as they were in the original fight. Sure, they hit harder, but if you didn't struggle with them in the IUDEX variant, you won't struggle now. Most of your damage on him will come after he inevitably misses 90% of his swings. One difficult thing here is telling when his combos will end during rage mode, but unlike some of the harder bosses with insane combos higher up on this list, the champ has a much harder time stun locking you into place. So if your health is above half, you can probably survive even if you do get hit a couple times. Fighting champion GUNDYR makes you feel like an absolute badass, weaving in and out of all of his meaty appendages. I'd let you be my champion if the game would let me gun. The Consume King really needs to do some consuming of his own. This dickless dragon wannabe has less BMI than an entire African village, yet he still somehow has the energy to slither around the arena like an anemic snake. His brittle arms and legs are very annoying to hit sometimes, so it's best to aim for either the ass or the face, depending on which happens to be the closest to you at any given time. OCEIROS almost feels like a faster VORDT. They both charge at you erratically, they both have weird frost breath, and you can stand underneath both of them for long periods of time and probably come out unscathed. Unlike VORDT, this malnourished monarch gets angry whenever you try to stick your finger up his bum, so be ready for that tail swipe after you get a couple hits in. None of OCEIROS' attacks are particularly hard to deal with alone, but the order in which he does them feels extremely random. Sometimes he'll summon up what's probably the last burst of energy in his crippled body to supply him and unleash a frenzy of claw swipes, tail tornadoes, and ice breaths so fast that you'll barely know how to react, but if you survive that, he'll sit there for a good 10 seconds putting up about as much resistance as his defenseless invisible bitch baby that won't shut up during the entire fight. I could never quite tell what this boss was about to do, making going in for hits a much more tedious and annoying task than any of the other previous bosses mentioned so far. Yes, the Twin Princes are this low on the list, and yes, I would absolutely love to hear your comment on just how wrong I am. I mean, this whole fight is basically just beating up an angry paraplegic and his crippled, fatigued dwarf brother. I'm sure Cartman himself could beat this disabled duo at the Special Olympics no problem. Now, don't get me wrong, this fight isn't easy. I died to the twins, or more specifically LORIAN, 4 times. From this point forward, we're in what I would call the moderate difficulty range, no more pushovers. Before fighting this boss, I'd heard horror stories about LORIAN teleporting around the arena at the speed of light, comboing countless Ashen ones into oblivion, but he wasn't that bad. Staying locked onto him gave me a general idea of where he was headed each time, and chances are if he's not right in front of you or in your peripherals, then he's probably right behind you. Who knew? Even if you do completely lose track of him, spam rolling in literally any direction has a decent chance of getting you away unscathed. Minus the teleporting, his basic sword swipes are easy to deal with once you understand the pattern, and he only has 3 or 4 different ways he swings the damn thing to begin with, so learning it doesn't take a long time either. LOTHRIC coming into the mix does basically nothing aside from adding 1 energy ball attack that will buttfuck your health if you let it hit you. Aside from that, it's the exact same fight you were in 20 seconds earlier. You can try sneaking in a couple pot shots on the crippled monkey if you'd like, but once you down LORIAN, you're taking out at least half of his health anyways, so I preferred to play things safe and just keep downing LORIAN, then switching over to beating on LOTHRIC as he tries to revive his dead brother. It's a bit fucked, but not as much as their existence to begin with. Patience and endurance are the key here. The only champion I've heard of in this game so far is GUNDYR, and I sure as hell hope he didn't decide to pick this pathetic shield spammer to protect his grave. When talking about the twin princes, I said we were done with pushovers, but that was a half lie. The Gravetender himself is a total joke. He poses almost no threat to you other than the annoyance you feel as he hides behind his shield for half the fucking fight. I eventually got tired of his turtle bullshit and decided to just tank his hits in hopes that he would leave himself open long enough that I could get some extra damage in on my own. This worked out well since he hits about as hard as your average early game enemy. The oh shit part of this fight comes when you hear the howl of that dreaded wolf, and from there you better pray to Jesus that you can finish off the Gravetender quickly, because the wolf does not fuck around. In this footage I handled the wolf much better than I did in my actual playthrough, but I still feel it has some very odd dodge timings. I don't like to bitch about game hitboxes, especially when it's almost certainly my fault when it comes to games as recent as Dark Souls 3, but there were plenty of times when I felt like I was out of the way of this wolf's wild charges just to be clipped by what looked like some fur, and oh shit, there goes half my health. Unlike the paraplegic princes, this fight felt like it had far less consistency and much more of a YOLO factor to it, which is why it gets the edge. This fight evokes the same energy for me as the Gravetender and Great Wolf, probably because they're both gank NPC fights thrown in the middle of a DLC. They also feel extremely similar in difficulty, but I gave Half-Light the edge since it felt like it dragged on forever. Last time the certified bitch mechanic was a shield, and this time it's being able to be healed. Multiple times, might I add. Half-Light himself can combo the living shit out of you if you get too greedy. Yeah, it's definitely your fault if you get stuck in this attack, but like, what the flying fuck, man? The other NPCs are pretty easy to deal with on their own, but sometimes Half-Light will send his magic from the other side of the arena and suddenly your health has been evaporated by his bullshit lightning balls. There were times too where my attacks would do triple damage and I couldn't tell why, unless this is just his stagger animation and it's only half a second long. Man, this video might not be the quality ranking, but you can probably tell I don't like either of these DLC fights I've talked about. I don't even want to make any jokes here, I'm just gonna move on. I didn't really think much of Dragonslayer armor the first time I beat him, but with the boss rush experience added on and some additional hindsight, I actually think this is a better fight than LORIAN and LOTHRIC. Obviously I find it more difficult too, and the main reason for that is his inconsistent speed. Sometimes this turtle tank will throw a couple normal sword swipes at you, only to follow it up with an extremely delayed slam or a lightning fast shield thrust. I certainly had a much harder time predicting him, and this bitch also has the ability to break the railings of the arena, which I never quite noticed until I rolled off it while trying to dodge an attack. Wish I had the footage of that one, I was pissed. I noticed a lot of people complain about the weird Lovecraftian moth things floating in the background, but they were never once an issue for me. Sometimes the RNG would have them fire significantly more shots than the previous fight, but as you can see here, they probably won't hit you if, oh I don't know, take a couple steps in any direction. I guess some people really struggle with this, but they were never more than a minor nuisance for me. Still, this is the boss where I would say things really start moving towards the challenging zone, as I died 7 or 8 times here on my original playthrough. I love these extremely self-descriptive titles like Ancient Wyvern, Dragonslayer Armor, and Old Demon King. They fit in almost a comedic way to me, especially when talking about this decrepit goober. Well, he looks the part at least, but this bad grandpa is anything but a pushover. In fact, taking into account the point I fought him in my playthrough, which was just after WOLNIR, he had one of the largest health bars in the entire damn game. As you'd expect from the king of these cunts, this demon granddad is quite fond of fire and shows you his infatuation with it by summoning a bunch of fucking fire meteors, which is honestly the easiest attack to avoid. Just run in any directions and these things will probably never hit you. In fact, most of his fire AoEs are predictable and easy to deal with. Just back the hell up whenever one of his tells begins and you'll be just fine. What is annoying is fighting him at close range for more than a few seconds. His hammer swings are wide and brutal, and I had a much harder time rolling past them than I did with most swords in the game. Sometimes you'll think you've successfully dodged a combo, only for his final slam to suddenly spawn a burst of fuck you fire, and then instead of getting a few precious hits in on the boss, you have to run away crying to heal. One thing that should definitely be mentioned is when nearing death, the old demon summons all of his remaining life force and turns into a walking nuke. The first time this happened I wasn't ready for it and promptly had my ass blown back out the fog gate. Thankfully it goes both ways since it seems like he blew out his pacemaker, judging by how he collapses and then lets you beat him to death. I'm aware that this fight can be done much later in the game, and I'm sure that would lower it by a few spots, but going off of my experience lands this old geezer just outside the top 10. Gods in the Soul series must not be all that special if the leader of these molesty ministers is able to gobble up one without much trouble. Well, after looking at one in action, I guess it makes sense. I haven't played the original Dark Souls this far through yet, but from what I can tell, Gwendolyn is a glorified walking simulator. Now that Aldrich has consumed the altar boy, he's unlocked his true potential as Mage Jesus. Most of this fight will consist of you running around the arena to avoid various blasts of magic, until you close in and he gives you an opening with one of his extremely long weapon windups. He's almost the opposite of old Demon King. Get in close and you can basically whack on him uninterrupted until he invokes his inner bitch and teleports away, but actually getting to him unscathed is a struggle. By the end of it, I learned to tank the lighter spells and to heal back up whenever he teleported, but make sure you avoid these big boy blasts or you'll be dead in an instant. A lot of people complained about the arrow attack, but I don't see how it's a big issue unless you come to Anne Orlando with the stamina of a snail. I found sprinting around the outskirts of the arena to be extremely effective in avoiding most, if not all, of the arrows. This fight boils down to how quickly you can learn it. It was pretty easy on my boss rush run, but memorizing all the tells for his various spells was difficult on my first playthrough. Either way, with a bit of patience you can send the daddy of all deacons back to his tomb. I always wondered what it would be like to fight the old Demon King in his days of glory, or at least that's what FromSoftware must have thought. Only there's two of them, and then one of them does the fusion dance with its dead sibling to gain its power? Yeah, I don't know what the lore here is, but the fight is great. The first half of this fight is my favorite gank in the series so far, keeping in mind that I've only played this game and the Shadows of YHORM from Bloodborne. This is because each demon takes turns being the big baddie while the other sits back and sprays his gunk at you. Kinda disgusting, but it makes for an extremely balanced fight. Even in the slight instance when both demons are up, if you've memorized their moveset, each individual attack is surprisingly easy to deal with. If I were basing this list off of how hard it is to learn and execute each boss, these princes might even be below Dragonslayer armor. The twist here is the second phase demon with the health bar the size of a small tank. He gains a couple new devastating moves that can obliterate you the first couple times you get there. Thankfully, most of his attacks are the same as the demons you were fighting earlier, but man is this the definition of an endurance fight. What keeps this from being higher on the list is the lack of challenge from the first phase once you've learned the demon's attacks. While the second phase is significantly more dangerous, you should already be familiar with about 3/4 of the moveset and also have enough Estus to power through it even if you do mess up a few times. Still, don't think I'm calling this demonic duo trio weak by any means. From here on out, I died to each boss at least 10 times in my first playthrough, with the exception of... Alright, listen, MIDIR is a hard boss. Like I said before, I struggled with every boss on the rest of this list, but the hardest boss in Dark Souls 3? That's what I was expecting going into this. I'd heard horror stories from friends and Reddit threads alike that MIDIR was this monstrous fire-breathing fuck who would hold me captive for hours, and then I ended up beating him in about 45 minutes flat. He reminds me a lot of the Demon Prince's second phase, being a giant beast that can shoot fire, lasers that will one-shot you if you touch them, flies around the entire arena if he wants, swipes at you a ton with his big meaty claws. In fact, now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like the Demon Prince fight prepared me really well for MIDIR. You handle many of their attacks similarly, and of course, they both have health bars of legendary proportions. MIDIR gets the edge over Demon Prince for doing more damage with most of his attacks and having some really shit camera angles that sometimes screw you over. I'll talk more about those in a minute. I'm really trying to understand why some people rank MIDIR over some of the bosses higher on this list, and all I can really come up with is the Statue of Liberty-sized health bar. His second phase adds in a couple new attacks, but they're probably the easiest to avoid out of his entire arsenal. I guess it helps that I never relied on my shield once in this game except for parrying, so by the time I reached the Darkeater, I was well versed in dodging enemies of all varieties. I don't really know what else to say here. Sound off in the comments if my opinion has bothered you enough to warrant that. Alright. I've seen a lot of jokes about the dancer's, figure, and I get it. Female boss who's got some alright curves on her. I mean, if I was the main character trapped in this world, you would definitely catch me down horrendously, begging for some of that grabby action when the competition is a weird slug trap, the ballsack tree, and hold the fucking phone, boys, we've been looking in the wrong place the entire time. God damn. While VORDT might make me hard in some ways, the dancer actually is a genuinely hard boss. Imagine trying to dodge the propellers of a speeding helicopter, and that's pretty much this fight in a nutshell. You can see I'm still not great at dealing with some of her attacks, especially in the second phase. It's actually a miracle I didn't die in this particular fight. I know I'm not the first to say this, but it impresses me at how well this fight feels like an actual dance. You have to react to every single one of her moves with your own well-timed dodges to come out unscathed then gain a chance to attack her. What makes this fight harder than the others so far is that I have trouble nailing the speed of her attacks. Some of her combos are lightning quick and felt way too fast even with my high roll speed, while others felt weirdly delayed and would catch me after my roll. To balance this, she has a decent wait time between different attacks. I even had sessions where I was able to hit her 5 or 6 times in a row without her feeling the need to react, so that keeps this fight from being any higher up on the list. While I wish we could dwell on the Tango this dancer puts up a bit longer, we have even harder bosses to move on to. Yes, the Abyss Watchers are harder than the Demon Prince. Yes, the Abyss Watchers are harder than the Dancer of the Bend Me Over Valley. And yes, the Abyss Watchers are absolutely harder than the Ancient Dragon that consumes the fucking Abyss itself for sustenance and turns it into instant death lasers. In my opinion, of course. Okay, real talk. These blasphemous looking motherfuckers kicked my ass. I know that's common for this game on the first go around, but they didn't feel much easier when I came to them overleveled in the boss rush. As you can tell by this footage, I'm abhorrent at dealing with anything in their first phase. Their speed is ridiculous for something placed this early in the game, and when multiple watchers come on screen, you can expect plenty of attacks from the back that you didn't see coming. Having good old Red Eyes help you out sounds nice, but when he and another watcher start duking it out, they kick up piles of dust bigger than they are, which can sometimes obscure the third watcher who's still trying to rip your balls off in very annoying ways. To be fair, I'm definitely making some dumb mistakes in this footage, like why the fuck am I trying to attack when all 3 watchers are literally a step and a half away from me? But there were plenty of other times where I would have 2 lightning fast attacks from completely different directions thrown at me, and dodging one would usually result in me running into the other. And man, the second phase. On my first playthrough, I must have gotten there at least 30 times, and every single time my ass was sent back to the bonfire with the power of this dick's flaming sword. At least this portion of the fight became easier for me when playing it again, but keep in mind that I'm overleveled and have extra Estus here. Originally, I would consistently run out of stamina, try to heal and get cucked for it out of nowhere, and all that after getting stuck in a foursome I didn't fucking ask to be in. If it's not obvious, I have a lot of pent-up rage against this triangle head trio. Abyss Watchers are stupidly difficult for their placement in the game, and they still put up a good fight when you come back overpowered, so they sit just outside the top 5. I was genuinely considering moving Abyss Watchers up to the number 5 spot, but gave Pontiff the edge since his combos are longer and hit harder. Unlike the Watchers, I didn't mind getting beat down by Pontiff. He felt like a much more fair encounter since there weren't any visual blockages like the dust and the Watchers, and the gank portion of the fight felt much more fair since you weren't being attacked by more than one thing at a time. I know what I just said might defeat the purpose of a gank for some, but the Demon Prince first phase did it perfectly. If you're gonna have multiple enemies attack you at once, give them different movesets and switch between which is the more aggressive opponent. Pontiff is also helped by the fact that he can be parried. I like this kind of high risk, high reward payoff. If you mess up, it's completely your fault and you take massive damage for it, but if you succeed, you come away with a decent chunk of his health. I find this to work better in the first phase since the second becomes much more chaotic, but I brought out my inner badass in this fight and pulled off my greatest parry of all time. Honestly proud of that one. Pontiff is extremely aggressive with both of his swords, like a second phase dancer on crack with less downtime in between attacks. You need to learn how to dodge every single combo he can throw at you, which is a lot. If you're going for the parries, you also need to find out which moves are the most reliable to go for, which added on even more learning for me. Thankfully, his second phase only introduces a couple new and very simple to deal with AoEs, but the clone makes it harder to parry and deal damage in general. Pontiff is a lot, but unlike the Abyss Watchers, I feel like his difficulty is justified since you're around the middle of the game at this point. Okay, maybe I would have swapped them with Dancer, but both of those bosses are great and challenging learning tools that make sure you're prepared for what lies ahead of you on your journey. The Nameless King is one intimidating bastard. He has an electro javelin, can summon strikes of lightning from the sky, summons up dust tsunamis just by blinking in your general direction, and he has a giant fucking chicken. Because of course he does. The first half of the fight has you facing off against the fire-breathing rooster, which has a pretty basic moveset aside from the occasional breath of fire. All things considered, it's actually quite easy compared to what's to come later, but there's still one small problem. the fucking camera. Whatever technology FromSoftware uses to make smooth and fair camera angles consistent throughout fights completely shits itself when a dragon boss is on screen. I mentioned MIDIR had these problems to a degree, but they were a lot easier to deal with since you ultimately want to fight MIDIR head on. When dealing with this colossal cock, you're consistently forced to dodge to the side or under the beast's neck whenever the king or any fire breath gets involved. At times, this makes the camera spaz out and forget how to function correctly for about 3 whole seconds, which doesn't sound like a huge deal, but this is Dark Souls 3. 3 seconds is all the game needs to find the entrance to your unwilling butthole. At least the Stormdrake's attacks are easy to deal with when you can, see him coming, and you have plenty of time to punish it after almost every move. Even with the camera bullshit, this phase is still pretty easy compared to what we've been talking about recently, which leads us into the battle with good old Nameless himself. This portion of the fight is significantly more fun and difficult. I would say Nameless has some of the hardest to dodge swipes in the entire game, since you have to consistently time your rolls much later than usual to not get clipped by his spear. As one might imagine, he can be lightning quick with his moves when he decides to, and I still can't tell when some of his attacks are coming, which is made very obvious by this footage. So yeah, when it comes to which boss I feel the least confident about memorizing and being able to handle each individual attack, Nameless definitely comes out on top. So why is he only number 4? Well, as you can also tell by the footage, it's ridiculously easy to heal right in front of him as the two of you participate in the most tension-filled staring contest of all time. Sure, I sometimes got punished for it, but more often than not, there was more than enough time to get an easy heal in after every single combo. As a result, you have much more room for error here than you do with the top 3. This fight is still batshit crazy, but that one flaw on the King's End allowed me to finish this fight without having to even fully learn it. Soul of Cinder is the final boss in the base game of Dark Souls 3, and another fight I feel like I've far from mastered. Like Nameless King, I still take tons of hits all the time in this fight, and unlike Nameless, the healing windows are far more dangerous, which is why Soul gets the edge. This cindery soul got possessed by the spirit of the Fire Nation, and is more than willing to show all his quirky powers off. He might have also gotten a couple Saiyan powers thrown in there as well, since he's able to summon a fucking Kamehameha blast that will make your health bar question its existence no matter how much you've pumped into vigor. Seriously though, Soul of Cinder might have the largest moveset in the entire game. Even on this boss rush session, I still felt like I was seeing some attacks for the first time, and that's after at least 20 fights with him in the base game. If I broke down every different phase he had, this segment would be 3 hours long, so let me talk about the one I felt was the hardest to deal with, the fucking magic phase. Listen, if I wanted to fight Old Bitch again, I'd roll right back up to Anor Londo and kick his pervy ass back to the Shadow Realm, but I do not need to be facing the buffed version of him in the middle of an already extremely chaotic fight. You can't get close to him in this phase because his stupid homing missiles will launch straight at your stupid face all at stupid once, or his stupid mana sword with a reach the size of YHORM's fat ass will slice through your stupid head. Okay, so why not stay at a distance? Oh yeah, he goes Goku on your ass and blasts you all the way back to Firelink Shrine. I found whenever he went into magic mode, I had to kiss any hopes of getting damage to him done goodbye for what felt like several years, and when he finally snaps out of it, his other attack modes aren't much easier. He has fiery sword swipes, fiery spear stabs, mustard gas, the power of Nagasaki, the list goes on. And when you finally get past his extremely draining first phase, you face the surprisingly easy and fun second half. Yeah, he does have that one fuck you combo that will probably one-shot you in almost every scenario, but if you can tell when it's coming and at least dodge the first couple swings, you'll be alright. From there, this honestly feels like fighting Pontiff if he only had the fire sword. It's still very challenging, but much easier to deal with than what came before it. This half of the fight makes you feel like an absolute badass, and when you finally turn this cinder into ashy nothingness, you're filled with an immense sense of pride as it sets in that you just beat Dark Souls 3. Gale is insane. I honestly don't know how else to describe it. Who would have thought that this old geezer who looked about 2 inches away from death every time we saw him would end up being the final boss in the DLC, and in turn the Souls trilogy? Not me, but don't take that as complaining. This fight is fucking magnificent in all 3 stages, and feels like an ultimate test of the skills you built up while playing Dark Souls 3. Like many of the other bosses I've mentioned up to this point, he's fast, unrelenting, hits like a fucking tank, and looks absolutely badass while doing it. With Nameless King and even Soul of Cinder to a degree, I mentioned not quite being able to learn or consistently deal with all their attacks, yet I was still able to squeak out a victory. With Gale, this is not the case. I had to learn every single thrust and swipe this Red Hood motherfucker had in his arsenal to even begin having a chance at coming out on top. The first phase is fast-paced and brutal, but limits Gale to only having his sword as a means of attack. While he's still a major threat, at this point you face tons of bosses with pokey sticks of all varieties, and after you've learned it, the only big problem here is stamina management. There's one combo in particular that has you rolling around 5 to 6 times to avoid taking damage, which is super satisfying to pull off, but absolutely drains that little green bar of yours. There were times where I only had enough juice to pull off the basic rolls to survive for 10 to 15 seconds, which was honestly terrifying. Still, once you've got this phase down, it's quite easy to do while only taking a few hits. The second phase is the easiest of the fight, although that's probably because he spends the least amount of time in it. His sword swings become slower and more predictable at the expense of hitting even harder and being followed up by his cape, which apparently gets flung at you hard enough to take a chunk of your health away with it. In order to dodge both portions of the attack, you basically have to be Dodge Jesus, which as you can see I am definitely not. What's nice about this bit is sometimes you can hit him as he winds up an attack, which will just cause him to forget about what he was doing a second prior. And he staggers for a few seconds at the end of the phase where you can chop off a good chunk of his health if you have the stamina to. Just know this stagger doubles as a charge for his upcoming AoE, but if you know it's coming, you can whack on him and dodge away from the blast with relative ease after it's, already killed you once or twice. This leads us into the third phase, which is the second phase if Gale took bath salts and gained the ability to levitate and control lightning. While him jumping around and floating in the air looks impossible to deal with, it's actually not too bad. The problem is, you're liable to roll right into the middle of a giant lightning strike when you dodge any of his attacks. Trust me when I say to tank the lightning, the alternative nearly gave me a heart attack. Speaking of a heart attack, I'm going to be playing the end of this fight on screen now, where you can see I have no Estus left and Gale is about 2 tickles away from sending me straight to an insane asylum. The ending to this fight was one of the most stressful things I've ever experienced, and the worst part is, he already killed me with less than 10% of his health several times already, so I really wasn't expecting to come away with the victory here. Gale is absolutely insane, what else can I say? Well, ladies and gentlemen, here's the fight that took me the longest amount of time to overcome when I first played it, which was nearly 4 hours. Sister FRIEDE and Father ARIANDEL are the boss I have the least confidence in my ability to do consistently. They are the boss that made me the angriest, well, aside from maybe these cunts, and pushed me to the limits of my skill in this game. Let me break down all 3 phases. The first phase alone would have secured the number 10 spot on this list. The blades of FRIEDE's scythe spin faster than a fucking washing machine, and even after hours of playing, I'm still barely comfortable with any of the dodge timings. It took me way longer than it should have to learn how to deal with her when she goes invisible, so let me break it down for you. When she disappears and jumps, if the big cloud of fog goes to the left, then she went to the right, and vice versa. If the fog goes upwards, she went behind you, which is really easy to deal with. A lot of the stress from this phase comes from how perfectly you're required to do it. The other 2 phases are just as difficult as this one, if not harder, so hoarding as much Estus as possible is enough. Aside from the invisibility, this portion is relatively straightforward, which leads us into the gank. Now I know this fight is infamous for its third phase, but I struggled with the gank portion far more than what came after it. It's made clear that Father ARIANDEL is the preferred target when it comes to dealing damage, but I really struggled to find good windows to get any hits in. While FRIEDE might remain fairly passive throughout this bit, her ice attacks on the ground would almost always close any opening I had on the Big Daddy himself. On top of that, I had a stupidly hard time dodging any of ARIANDEL's slams. They're extremely telegraphed, move at the speed of a dying slug when compared to anything FRIEDE deals out, and should act as the perfect time to get behind and punish, but I just couldn't deal with them. At least it's super easy to prevent any healing from happening. If you notice that FRIEDE hasn't sent an ice blast over your way in about 10 whole seconds, then chances are she's getting ready to heal. Just run over and beat her over the head a couple times and boom, no stupid healing. I think the main reason I struggled with this phase was a severe lack of patience and generally being bad at gank fights, so this could have been a breeze for some of you. After you beat the daddy down, FRIEDE gets rather angry and decides to go Super Saiyan on your sorry ass. This phase is all about knowing when you can attack FRIEDE with relative safety. With many enemies and bosses in this game, if you successfully dodge an attack or combo, you get a chance to deal some damage of your own if you have the stamina to. FRIEDE says fuck that and will avoid your sword for a minute straight, even if you deal with all of her moves perfectly. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but you definitely need to take the time to tell which of her moves will leave her open for a second, such as the double ice scythe spin or her certified plague slam. Knowing how she travels when she goes invisible helps tons in this phase. You can see me take advantage of it to get some easy damage since she's surprisingly passive while jumping around like a monkey. While Black Flame Friede is definitely fast and merciless, I think it's a bit overhyped from some players. What makes this fight the juggernaut of difficulty that it is putting all 3 phases together. Each individual phase is already worthy of a spot in the top 10, and managing Estus throughout the entire fight is both necessary and stressful. There were times when it felt overbearing and I was convinced I couldn't do it, and while I did manage to overcome it, I felt more drained than satisfied at the end of it all. Not counting some radiant forms of bosses in Hollow Knight, looking at this motherfucker, this is the hardest boss battle I've faced in any video game to this day. I'm interested to see if any other bosses in the Soul series will end up passing Friede, which I guess I'll find out soon, since as of writing this script I'm in the middle of my first ever Bloodborne playthrough. Be sure to leave your own rankings in the comments. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on my list and see your own. Thanks for watching, guys. Peace.